Hello everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Math with Dr. War. Today's lesson focuses on graphing linear inequalities, a high-emphasis topic on the Tasc examination. On the Tasc test, you will be asked to graph linear inequalities. Well, you're not actually going to physically graph them. Your test is multiple choice. Therefore, they're going to give you a graph, and you have to identify the linear inequality, or they'll give you the linear inequality and you have to identify the correct graph. In order to do that, there are 3 steps you must follow. The first step, identify the boundary line. If your boundary line is a solid line, you're using the inequality signs of less than or equals or greater than or equals. Here's a little tip. Remember, less than or equals have that equal sign. And that equal sign is your clue that you will have a solid line. So if you have an inequality symbol of less than or equals or greater than or equals, that equal sign indicates you will have a solid boundary line. A dashed boundary line is indicated by the inequality symbols of less than or greater. Step number 2 looks at the shading of your graph. So you're going to look at where the shading is in comparison to your boundary line. So if the shading is above the boundary line, you're looking for the inequality symbols that are greater or greater than or equals to. Always let the words help you. Above will always signify greater. So if you see the shading is above, you know you're looking for a greater or greater than or equals inequality sign. If the shading is below the boundary line, you're looking for the inequality symbol of less than or equals. Remember, below means less. At times on the Tasc test, step 1 and step 2 will give you your answer choice. However, sometimes you may come across a high difficulty problem and you will need to go to step number 3. Step number 3, you will have to identify your slope, and remember, slope is rise over run, and the slope is always connected to your x. And also, you may have to identify your y-intercept, which is your b, and that is where your line cuts the y-axis. Now, I have a little chart here to help us out. Remember, a solid line is when you have the greater than or equals or less than or equals. And always remember the y variable is always on the left. And I find for the Tasc test, they always have the y variable on the left. If you have a dashed line, you have the inequality symbols of either greater than or less than. Shaded above means you have that greater than or equals to or just greater than. So above goes with the greater. Shaded below goes with either less than or equals or less than or equals to. So when you see that word less, it means below. Now our first problem states, the diagram below shows the graph of which inequality? So we have a graph and you have 4 inequalities and we have to choose the correct one. First step, let's identify our boundary line. Notice our boundary line is solid. If you have a solid boundary line, we're looking for the inequality symbols of less than or equals or greater than or equals. As I found my inequality symbols, I go to my answers and I start eliminating. So I can eliminate number 1 because that has a greater than symbol, and number 3 which has a less than symbol. Next, I'm going to look at my shading for my graph. Now the shading for my graph is below. Now if it's shaded below, we're looking for a less than or equals inequality symbol. And the one that has a less than or equals inequality symbol is number 4. Number 4 states y is less than or equals to x minus 1. Notice I only had to use step 1 and step 2. I identified my boundary line, which was a greater than or equals or a less than or equals. I went to my answer choices and I began to eliminate, which left me with 2 answer choices. I then looked at the shading. It was shaded below, and below indicates a less than or equals inequality symbol, and I looked for that in my inequality and was able to choose my answer. Which inequality is shown in the accompanying diagram? Step 1, let's look at our boundary line. Our boundary line is a dashed line. Dashed line is associated with a less than or equals or a greater than or equals. With that information, I'm going to go to my answer choices and I can eliminate number 3 and number 4 because they have that equal sign there. Less than or equals or greater than or equals. I'm going to look at the shading of my graph. The shading is above, and if you're shaded above, it means that you are greater. So we're looking for a greater than inequality symbol. Therefore, my answer is number 1 because it says y is greater than 3 over 2x plus 2. So my answer is number 1. I identified my boundary line. It was a dashed line. I eliminated 3 and 4. I then looked to see where the shading was at. It was above. Above means greater, and I was able to pick my inequality. Which inequality is represented by the graph below? Again, let's identify our boundary line. Our boundary line is solid. Because it's solid, we're looking for a less than or equals or a greater than or equals. When I go to my answer choices, I have less than or equals or greater than or equals. I cannot eliminate any of them. I'm going to now look for my shading. My shading is above. Above is represented by greater than or equals. I can eliminate number 1 because that's less than or equals, and I can eliminate number 3, which is less than or equals. My answer is either 2 or 4. Now notice we have to go to step number 3 where we need to identify our slope. Now remember, your slope is your m, which is attached to the x. So for answer number 2, my slope is 2, and for answer number 4, my slope is -3. Now I'm going to look at my slope. One has a positive slope, one has a negative slope. So I'm not actually going to calculate the slope. I'm going to look at my line and decipher whether I have a positive slope or a negative slope. Remember, when you read your line, you go from left to right. So remember, from my slope videos, I think about walking up the line or walking down the line. So I'm starting here and it looks like I'm going up. So this is going to indicate a positive slope. Therefore, my answer is number 2. So by looking to see whether I have a positive slope or a negative slope, I was able to select my correct answer choice. You could have also gone for the Y-intercept. Here is your Y-intercept. So your Y-intercept, your line is in the negative region. Notice here, your Y-intercept is -3, while here your Y-intercept is +2. So just by going by the Y-intercept, you could have selected number 2 as your answer choice. And if you want to, you can count it, -1, -2, -3. A positive Y-intercept would be in this region. Remember, up here is positive and down here is negative. Which inequality is represented by the graph below? So let's identify our boundary line. Our boundary line is a dashed line. So we're looking for either a less or greater than inequality symbol. Now when we look at our inequality symbols, they're all less. So we don't need that. Let's look at our shading. Our shading is below. And we know below means a less than. So 1 and 2 did not help us. Now let's look at our slope. Now remember, when you read the line, you go from left to right. So if you think about taking a little walk, notice that this is going down. So this is actually a negative slope. So we have a negative slope. Therefore, I can eliminate number 1 because that has a positive slope, a +2. Okay, my answer may be number 2 because this has a negative slope. I can eliminate number 3 because that's a positive slope. It's a half. So my answer is either 2 or 4 because these have negative slopes. Okay, let's look at our y-intercept. Our y-intercept is here. This is where our line is cutting the y-axis. And if you notice, all of these have a positive 1. So that didn't help us. Okay, we're going to actually have to physically calculate the slope. So we have to find where to put our next point. So that would be right here. Now remember, slope is rise over run. So I'm rising 1, 2 units. So that's a positive 2 for my rise. And now I'm running to the left. I'm running to the left, so that's 1. So that will be a negative 1 because you're going to the left. And 2 divided by negative 1 is negative 2. So I'm looking for a slope of negative 2. Answer is number 2. Number 4 has a slope of negative a half. Now this question will be considered high difficulty. The reason that it's high difficulty is because we actually had to calculate the slope. We couldn't use the method we used in the previous problem where one of the slopes was positive and one was negative. So we figured it out. Both of these slopes were negative. So because they were both negative, we actually had to physically calculate. And also they all had the same y-intercept. So that didn't even make a difference. In these examples, notice we're given the inequality and we have to pick the correct graph. Which graph represents the inequality y greater than or equals x plus 3? Now, just as before, we're going to look at our inequality symbol. That inequality symbol is going to provide all the information we need. Now, our inequality symbol is greater than or equals to. Because it has that little bar there, I'm looking for a solid line. Therefore, I can eliminate number 1 and I can eliminate number 3. Now, remember, because this is greater than or equals, where is our shading? It is shaded above. So we're going to look to see where we have the shading above. Number 2, the shading is above. So our answer is number 2. 4, the shading is below. Remember, we had a greater than or equals, which indicates shading in the above region. Which graph represents the solution of 2y plus 6 greater than 4x? Remember I told you, if the y is on the left-hand side, no matter if anything is added to it or subtracted for it, as long as it's on the left-hand side, we are okay. So our y is on the left, that's good. I don't really care about the plus 6. Let's look at our inequality sign. Our inequality sign is greater. So because it's greater, we're looking for a dashed line. So we can eliminate number 2 because that's a solid and number 4. Now, if you have a greater than symbol, it means that your shading is above. So we're looking for above shading. This shading is below, so we can eliminate number 1. Our answer is number 3. Which graph represents the solution of y greater than negative 2 over 3x plus 2? So again, let's look at our inequality symbol. It is greater, so we are going to have a dashed line. All 4 answer choices have a dashed line. Okay, if it's greater, it's shaded above. A is shaded above, so that could be my answer. B is shaded below, so we can eliminate. C is shaded above, so this can be my answer. And D is shaded below, so we can eliminate. So greater means shaded above, so we look to see who was shaded above, which was either A or C. Let's look at our slope. The slope we have here is a negative slope. So we have a negative slope, and if it's a negative slope, it means that you're going downhill. Remember, when we read our slope, we're going from left to right. So if I go this way, this is indicating a positive slope. So we can eliminate A. Our answer is C, because when we read our line here, notice this is going downhill. So this is our negative slope. So our answer is C. Now this question, again, will be considered a high difficulty problem. I hope this lesson has been helpful. Good luck in the Tasc examination.